Hey everyone, I'm super excited to be sitting down with Deloitte's chief futurist, Mike Bechtel. He's the guy who the leaders of some of the world's biggest companies go to make sense of what's new and next in tech. What I really want to know from Mike is not just what tech is coming next, but what he's been telling CEOs about how AI is going to impact our jobs and our workforce. Who is safe and for how long? And by the way, as a professional advisor, is there an existential threat to him and Deloitte? Let's find out. I'm here with Mike Bechtel, who's the chief futurist at Deloitte. Thanks so much for being here today, Mike.
Oh, Jeff, what a treat. Glad to be had.
Amazing. So let's jump right into it. You're chief futurist at Deloitte. What are the biggest, kind of tech disruptors that are on your radar right now in terms of impact that you think that they're going to have in the world, to organizations? What's on your radar?
Yeah, well, one of my conceits, and I think our team's approach to this space of foresight, futures, emerging tech, if you will, Jeff, is this idea that futurists are not so secretly historians. And when we try to make heads or tails out of what's new and next in tech, our first move is always to look for precedents, right? Trajectories, patterns from the past. And, I think on one hand, if I were to say, Jeff, this AI thing has legs, it's really something, you'd think like, oh boy, Captain Obvious over here. But when you look at the AI moment through the historical lens, right? And you say, okay, the whole history of enterprise IT has more or less been a story of simpler interfaces, smarter databases, and more performant number crunching places, right? The kind of that three-tiered internet architecture, if you will. You say, okay, AI isn't new, right? It's always been machine intelligence on the make for nearly 100 years. But there's a heck of a lot new in AI. And so to me, the biggest disruptor right now is the fact that AI waterline has raised right up to that point of not just human cognition, but executive decision-making, right? The creative arena. And so I think the reason we get so many think pieces about AI right now is because AI's just hit the point where it too can write a think piece. And that understandably freaks people out a little bit.
I'm glad you went there, and I love the waterline analogy. And it feels like, and I'm curious on your perspective, that we're at this sort of inflection point where it's more and more in the news. The waterline is continuing to rise, and I don't know, maybe in some ways rising more rapidly than like we're floating, I guess, if I can use that analogy. Like it feels like we're watching it rise and we're not quite, above the water necessarily as individuals or as organizations. I mean, do you buy that analogy? And, where do you expect to see the water line, in the next handful of years? Is it gonna, you talked about AI's moment. Is it going to slow down? Is it going to increase? I know I'm asking you to prognosticate, but where's your head at?
It's all good. It's all good. It's in my job description. What kind of futurist doesn't dare future a little bit? Jeff, I think a lot about this idea of the waterline and our sort of sinking, swimming, or rising above. In fact, it probably consumes most of my and my team's cycles these days. And here's our best educated take. Okay. Automation is a Trojan horse for elevation. And what I mean by that is, if you think about this rising waterline as the end of today's work, the disappearance of today's jobs, and the rote automation of today's best practices, it can feel pretty bleak, right? I use this notional protagonist, this little cartoon character in my mind, and I call him Toby. If it's, okay, waterline's coming for Toby, stinks to be Toby, like, oh no. That's not good stuff. But here's the deal. David Packard of Hewlett Packard, he had this line that I love. He shared it a few years ago, and by a few, I probably mean like 40. He said, "You can't shrink your way to success." Well, here's where I'm going with this, Jeff. If you look at all this automation as a license to do today's work with fewer people and fewer dollars, right? You'll please your shareholders, your stakeholders for a couple quarters, but eventually somebody with no business being in your business comes around, they put you out of business. Why? Because A, they've hired Toby, and B, they're not worried about speeding up today's work. They're getting busy cooking up tomorrow's work. And so to me, the narrative here is, okay, best practices are going to get automated left, right, and center. Good news, that frees us up to cook up next practices, to get busy building tomorrow. And that's a different ball of wax. That requires imagination. It requires ambition and courage. Um, it does not require, traditional double ledger accounting and, cost takeout.
I love that approach, and the idea of building tomorrow as like yeah, as like a corporate capability. Like we're getting really good at building tomorrow. I mean, first of all, it's making me reflect on like how many companies, how many government agencies are actually good at that right now. And the idea that it's something we should be good at is really exciting. And I love the optimistic take on it. I want to come to like the pessimistic take on it in a minute, but I want to focus on the optimistic piece for now. Um, it sounds like for the Tobys of the world, your message is, hey, you may not have the same work tomorrow that you had yesterday, but you're going to have cooler work. You're going to have more impactful work, and work that can actually make more of a difference with this kind of rising water level. What do we need to get right to get there? How do we learn that? Like it's, and I don't mean to dunk, but like it's for us on a podcast, it's very easy to say like, oh, what you need to do is like you just need to build the future. Like how do you unpack that for the people and the leaders that you're speaking with? Like what
Right,
do we need to get right to be able to do that?
right. I'm with you. I'm with you, Jeff. I want to not only acknowledge but honor your great question, because there's that classic comic strip popular among geeks for the last 30 years where it's the scientists at a chalkboard and they have all this math for step one. And then step two says, then a miracle occurs. And then step three has, a QED and a happy ending. And you're right. A lot of these sort of pithy, pardon the expression, but Pollyanna takes on
Mhm.
AI presume that some rainbow-laden miracle will occur and make everything right. I think it's a little more nuanced. And when we talk about the opportunity for beautiful, better work for the Tobys out there, I think it's imperative to recognize that the Tobys need to participate in their own rescue. And and what I mean by that, right? This isn't some table pounding curmudgeon talking about personal responsibility and bootstraps, though there's pieces of that. Because what we're seeing in our research, Jeff, is historically, not just in this AI moment, but again, back to historians and deep time, the greatest breakthroughs, right? And in the steepest parts of history's S curves of progress, they've typically come from cross-pollination between domains, right? People who can mash up a little bit of biology and a little bit of engineering and then, just like good old Leonardo da Vinci, that becomes the basis for an elevated understanding, right? Hedy Lamarr, Hollywood actress, glamorous as it gets, figuring out that a little player piano engineering mashed up with a little bit of mathematics could create a frequency hopping spread spectrum technique that went on to be the basis for torpedo tech. What? I think the point that I'm making here, Jeff, is the Tobys of the world have the opportunity to go wider, cross pollinate historical silos, and create tomorrow's breakthroughs. I believe that breadth is going to be the new depth, that wide is going to be the new deep, and that dot connectors are going to have a much better time over the next 20 years than say dot perfectors. I think expertise is going to be sort of overrated in
Mm.
this world where machines come in hot for all the known siloed disciplines.
So when you look at the impact that AI is going to have over the next few years, you see it first and foremost coming for like deep expertise in specific areas. And the value to us becomes, how do we provide that context? How do we provide, ask the right question, understand the framing that's going to help harness that? Is that a fair summation?
It is. It is because, Jeff, to a machine, the difference between, say, tic-tac-toe, a child's game from a logic standpoint,
Right.
the difference between tic-tac-toe and the Chinese game of Go, right? Dramatically combinatorially more complex. It's to a machine, the difference between those two is just a matter of chips and disks, right? It's the difference between a matter of degree and kind, as they say in the legal field. And so that's
Mm.
all to say, machine intelligence. Good old Gary Kasparov said this. He was the first human who ever got licked by a machine at a uniquely human task, right? Chess. Kasparov said, anything we can do and we know how we do it, a machine will do it better. And so if you think of your professional role is that you're a master of something, good luck bringing that carbon to a silicon fight, right?
Mm.
Because the robots are indeed coming for your known niche. But if you're a connector, if you're a curiosity-filled cross-pollinator, game on. Robots haven't seen that yet.
How do you see that? I'm very curious because you're chief futurist. You've got a research function. I imagine you work with a team. You said something really interesting, actually. I think at South by Southwest this year that caught my attention, which is that AI is now starting to get better than your best people. Was I think what you said.
Yeah.
And like, keep me honest if that's not it. So I'm curious, like what has this looked like in your world, and how has it? I don't know if the right language is it's forced your team to evolve, or it's, just pushing you to all be better and helping you raise the bar.
Yeah. It so so you did hear me correctly. When I say AI better than our best people, that certainly isn't to besmirch, my friends and colleagues. Rather, I'll anchor this in a little bit of personal history. Jeff, I remember in before that ChatGPT moment, before November of 22, I was showing one of my clients a an early general pre-trained transformer. So think of it as proto ChatGPT. And I'll never forget the demo I showed him involved Shakespeare. It's like, Randy, look, this thing fakes Shakespeare at a level that would fool a Shakespeare scholar. And he was a West Texan with literal cowboy boots and a literal cowboy hat. He says, Mike, we we do not make poetry. We make hydraulic systems. And I got to thinking like, oh, okay, this isn't going to amount to much. But that same guy, Jeff, right? God bless him. He comes back to me in roughly 2023, right? This is after the ChatGPT moment. He says he's found this tool that'll answer tactical and strategic questions for his hydraulics business. And his quote to me, which killed me at the time, he says, it's not as good as my best people, but between you and me, it's better than the rest of them. And
Right.
right. And Jeff, I thought this is that classic moment where pride of place, right? The human condition is such that we need to feel like we're just like one step ahead of all these things we're building, right? Well, the difference between 23 and 25, right? 2023 and 2025 is that you can now kick off a world-class, 25-page research report, 35 sources in about 6 minutes. And I showed one of these as a proof of concept to my own team, and they all looked at me and they said, that it was complete in 7 minutes is a mechanical miracle. That I don't think, this is them talking, that I don't think I could, get that banged out given 7 weeks. That's the real revelation. And so again, that doesn't mean, yikes, pack our bags and give up. I think what it means is that sort of depth of expertise, Sherlock Holmes treasure hunt, that's a machine's game now, man.
So, I mean, it makes complete sense, and I think I can envision two different frames of mind for your team, right? Like if you're a career researcher and that's what you do, you're Sherlock Holmesing it. I love how you put that. Like you think, okay, well, I either need to brush up my resume or I need to go back to school and learn how to become a plumber, like on the negative side, or you can kind of ask the question, like if this is the case, if I have this tool available, what do I need to do that's going to elevate what's going on here? So if you're going to take the happy path, what does that look like? And how are you starting to have that conversation?
Well, this, Jeff, is where we can get pretty practical, and I think pretty tactical with this idea of automation as a Trojan horse for elevation,
Hmm.
and as this stuff being an opportunity for good news. Okay, I'll give you an example of what this has meant for my team. My team, prior to this AI fueled moment, you know, 5 to 15 people, depending on the way we've been composed over the last, call it 5 to 10 years, doing annual flagship reports on a handful of topics that matter most to our enterprise clients. Great. Yep, that was right-headed, right, and right-minded at the time. Well, when we saw that we could bang one of these out every hour on the hour, with the help of these robot brains, we didn't pack it in. Rather, we said, okay, we've gone from hammer to jackhammer. What do clients actually want? They don't want hammers or jackhammers. They've got nails, right? They have itches in need of scratching. They're thirsty for insight, direction, somebody to stamp out ambiguity. And so what we've learned, Jeff, is, okay, so what you want are more frequent, lighter weight steers, right? And by steer, I mean, tiny course corrections, as opposed to big annual thwomp book reports. Cool. All right, we got you. How about a cheap and cheerful subscription? How about the time we've saved in producing the wordcraft? What if we build workshops and collaborative
Mhm.
calls where we talk it through and we roll up our sleeves and we help you turn the talk into walk? And so behind this all, Jeff, I think it's a need for that entrepreneurial spirit to say, A, let's lead with need. What do our customers want now that we could give them anything? Oh, you want X? Cool, we can do that. And then B, realizing that, yeah, what got you here won't get you there. Right. So let's go build cooler stuff. Let's not make the old stuff faster.
It's such an interesting story, Mike. Like the reason to me it's so interesting is like when I process the moral of it, when you tell me the more you're doing, it's it sounds like it's more time with people,
Mhm.
right? Like it's pulling people out from, behind their keyboard, behind the desk, behind the dark cavern where they're researching and saying, you know what? The value that we bring here is eyeball to eyeball, right? Whether it's in the same room physically, whether it's in a meeting, it's being able to help people to understand their needs and actually give them something ultimately more human. I don't know. Does that resonate with you?
Deeply. I mean, honestly, Jeff, I know, halfway through my life's journey between optimistic geek and pragmatic geezer, I know that I lean techno optimist, right?
Mhm.
It's who I am because it's what I've lived and seen. But I tell you, the thing that I've seen firsthand, both on my team, with my clients, and then more broadly over a nearly 30-year career up to my eyes in all things newfangled, is that technology is just a puffy-chested 4-syllable synonym for tool, and tools are force multipliers for human ambition. And so when I look at AI, I look at it as the latest, greatest opportunity to automate muck so we can get busy doing more
Mm.
magic. And okay, so what does that mean? I think it means stuff like you just said, right? Sitting with our fellow humans, understanding, like in an empathy-filled way, where are you stuck and how can I help? Right? Because I've got a genie lamp full of hammers for any of your needs, but let's spend more
Mm.
time sitting with each other's needs. Uh, I had the opportunity to give a speech to my high school a couple weeks ago, and I told these young folks, I said, "Listen, cool it with hyper specialization at a young age, right? Because as we just discussed, the robots are coming, right? Be a cross pollinator." But the second thing I said was, it's the revenge of the humanities, right? Synthetic thinking, conceptual cross pollination. I chuckle, Jeff. Prompt engineering as a term. It makes me smile because it's exactly what an engineer would call the humanities, right? Like
Mhm.
asking thoughtful synthetic questions with a variety of colorful language. Oh, you mean reading and writing. I think humanities strikes back in a big way.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I don't remember what forum it was on, but I saw like a post, on some sort of social the other day that where someone had posted something saying, while I was trying to formulate my prompt properly for ChatGPT, I ended up actually figuring out the answer to my question. And someone responded, "Oh, I see you've discovered thinking." Right?
Oh, Jeff, Jeff. One of my dearest friends is he's an English professor at the University of Notre Dame named David Griffith. Uh, we played in a ska band together in the 90s, so it doesn't get a lot more authentic lived experience than 2 trombones and a, guitar. But Dave and I have been having this discussion, this pen pal discussion for the last 3 years, because his thesis, which I think he saw earlier than anybody else in my social or professional network, he says, and I don't mean to make him sound too much like Jack Kerouac or anything, but he's got sweet vibes in that way. He goes, "Yeah, I don't think these geeks realize that writing is thinking. Thinking is writing. You can't outsource that." And I remember thinking, like, "Oh, don't be a curmudgeon. Don't be a Luddite." 2 years in, I concede, David, you've heard it here. I was wrong and you were right. The the way we believe what we believe and think what we think comes from the activity of stringing those thoughts together and chewing on that pencil and running your fingers through your hair in that frustrated way. That's thinking.
I completely agree, but I'm curious, as you say that, it sounds like implicitly in that there's kind of a right and a wrong way to use generative AI.
Hmm. I mean, at the risk of flipping the script, Jeff, just because 'cause I'm such a chatterbox, I would ask you, maybe tell me a little bit more about what you've seen and or what you mean there, man. Like, do you feel like you've developed a bit of a moral sense of what icky looks like versus righteous?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm happy to be the guest for
Yeah,
the next
please.
90 seconds or so.
Please.
Sure, why not? Sounds good. So yeah, I mean, let me tell you what I mean. I'll give you a personal illustrative example. We're having this conversation today. If I want, I can open up, a generative AI tool and I can say, "Hey, I have a technology podcast and Mike Bechtel's coming on today. What are a bunch of great questions I can ask him?" I hit enter and I copy and paste and I, absorb the answers and I ask you those questions. And honestly, I think they'd probably be half decent.
Mhm.
But if you do that, I really believe, assuming I'm just not like a completely useless host, I really believe you lose something.
Yeah.
To me, there's there's a whole exercise involved in what are we trying to accomplish here? What do we want to talk about? Who is Mike? Like how can I conceive of this? And at some point, if I want to, if I've got my outline of story and questions and I say, "Hey, ChatGPT, Now that I've formulated it, I want your opinion to synthesize into mine. By the way, I didn't end up using ChatGPT. This is all organic today, baby. But to me, there's just do you think first or do you outsource the thinking first? And I've heard a lot of, between you and me, I've heard a lot of stories corporately about, oh, I didn't know how to tackle this. And before I even thought about it, I just parroted the question into Copilot or some sort of
Mm.
generative AI tool and copy and pasted what it said. And that just, I don't know. There's something that icky is the word you used, and I'll parrot that.
Yeah. Icky. It feels icky and inauthentic and you know, okay, so first of all, thank you for being the guest on the Jeff Nielsen show. Great.
Thank you. There you go.
Yeah. But Jeff, I think what you just taught me there is this recognition that I think intent matters so greatly here, because when you're out to accomplish a particular end, okay, um, there's typically this, I think, this calculus that most companies do, where they say, okay, there's going to be a set of differentiated approaches that we take that make us who we are and make us great. And then there's a set of supporting capabilities that are the cost of goods sold and the context, right? And so if I'm thinking about, let's say you're a rock and roll band, right? You want to play sweet licks and you want to deliver goosebumps to the audience, and you want to, you have art and poetry to get out at high decibels. But contracting, right? Venue selection, audiovisual cabling regulations, clearly that's the necessary context that supports your core mission. Where am I going with this? I feel like right-headed business people, right? Or not-for-profit leaders or government civil servants. I think right-headed people are suddenly facing this decision between what is it that you're out to do? What is your meaning, your core? And what subset of your week has just been noisy context? And I think a whole set of people are starting to realize, okay, if I can automate the muck and repurpose the cycles on my core, then maybe that's a high order ethical use of AI. But if my job is to be a corporate strategist and I spend my week asking the robots, hey, what's the strategy? I think we have a 21st century ethics problem there, or integrity problem. So these are fresh thoughts that you've helped catalyze in me, Jeff, but I do. I think it maybe comes down to intent and what's your core versus your enabling.
I was just chuckling because it's such a humanities answer, and I have a humanities background too, to like take all of this tech stuff into like an ethics problem.
Yeah.
But no, I agree with you, and frankly, I think in addition to being an ethics problem, it's probably at some point going to be a business results problem, because if your company outsources the thinking, what's left, and I don't know, maybe I just don't have as much fear of this technology as some people do, but I think if you have a human thinking and you know AI thinking, at least for the next handful of years, the human is probably going to win at that abstract, or I think, as you said, the interconnectivity and the integration thinking part.
I mean, if we really pull back from the existential dread and the future shock and the financial everything,
Hmm.
the little kid in me marvels that we now have the Star Trek ship computer. I mean, here it is. It's ready.
Yeah.
There it is. Right? It doesn't even feel like it's an alpha anymore. There it is. And you can ask for whatever you want, short of an actual Earl Grey tea compiled before
Mm.
you. That's probably coming too. But one of the reasons I've always thought science fiction is not just folly, but useful, is it allows you to think about these sort of a world beyond the typical constraints. And what Gene Roddenberry and and his successors in the Star Trek universe, they always thought about was things like what would the human experience be like post information scarcity, post economic scarcity, post material scarcity. And he very consciously went into the belief that it's just going to be about human relationships, about right versus wrong, about inclusivity versus exclusivity, and stamping out knuckleheadery and ignorance. And so I choose to believe we live in a world that's going to be elevated thanks to the automation of these things, not some crass utopia where people are, faking long-winded emails so that the
Mm,
counterparty can decompile them with their own bot.
right. Yeah. AI can write the performance review and read the performance review,
Right.
right? Like that's yeah. So I love that vision. And by the way, I buy into that vision as well. There's a question that's being asked implicitly or explicitly lately, Mike, that I'm sure you faced in some capacity that I want to put a fine point on and I want to get your reaction to, which is, you and I both have these kind of professional services backgrounds or are working for professional services organizations. There's there's a voice out there right now that says like Deloitte, who needs Deloitte? I have AI. What use could I possibly have for, Deloitte and, consultants and professional services when I have AI? Like I have the ship's computer. I don't need anything else.
Yeah.
And I'm deliberately asking that a little bit facetiously, but and I don't expect you, to say, they're right, abandon ship or anything like that. But but tell me, like in your own words, why are they wrong?
Yeah.
What makes the value and experience you get of an organization, of a professional services organization, so important in this? I think you called it AI moment right now.
Yeah. Well, I would be intellectually dishonest if I didn't admit that I've been wrestling with different altitudes of this question for the last couple of years, right? Because, I'll never forget I had a mentor years ago, couple firms ago as well.
Mm.
And I remember, not that he was a cigar chomping boomer, but the image is better if we pretend he is. Just imagine, you imagine
Got it.
Thurston C. Howell vibes from Gilligan's Island. But he said, there's never not going to be a market for smart people. And I thought to myself, well, that's reassuring, sir, right? I'm in the smart people business. Thank goodness. Well, then as we've been discussing, electronic Einsteins showed up and oh goodness gracious, what do we do? Well, here's what I've come to learn, right? And I believe this both objectively and as a bit of a daily affirmation. I had an old business partner when I was a venture capitalist, Jeff. He had this great line. I probably use it weekly. He says, "You can't read the label when you're sitting inside the jar."
Mm.
It's kissing cousins with the old line, you can't see the forest for the trees, but what makes it different is he's arguing with that line that our expertise can sometimes get in our own way. And our knowledge of a given domain blinds us to breadth, to cross pollination, to pattern recognition. One of the things that I've seen that Deloitte is so good at, right? And I think that professional services firms provide is there's a court vision, a pattern recognition that says, you know, government level logistics have some curious things in common with the production of Hollywood movies, which in turn have some unintuitive things in common with the way we build LCD panels in Southeast Asia, right? And I think that idea of having someone, Margaret Mead in anthropology, here's an orthogonal reference. Margaret Mead famously said that to be a good student of a culture, you needed to be what she called a participant observer, right? You needed to have enough critical distance to be able to dispassionately and objectively write about and think about them. But you needed to be close enough to it where you weren't, a charlatan or a dilettante
Mm.
either, right? That's what I think professional services is right now in 2025. It's that 1 foot in the jar, 1 foot outside the jar, participant observer mojo, where you can say, "Okay, yeah, there's an increasing share of detailed thinkery that we'll hand off to the bots, as opposed perhaps to that, you know, wizened veteran or scrappy
Hmm.
young analyst." But that willingness to think broadly, that skill set is better held outside the 4 walls of the organization, in my opinion, than as someone who has to live in the organization and feel like they're pretending to be objective and dispassionate.
Got it. So you see all of that as sort of and feed this back to me if it makes sense
Yeah.
or not. You see this more as kind of like a role than just necessarily an individual skill. Because if I'll use like a very simplistic example, but if I'm just Toby and I work inside I work inside an organization, I work inside the bottle, and I just say like, "Hey, AI, look broadly and tell me what you see."
Right.
Your ability to affect change inside the bottle, your ability to still see the forest for the trees, see the label is in some way impacted by that. Or like, is it that the tools we have are not good enough to see out the bottle? Is it that your position is still inside the bottle? What
Well
what's the magic there?
well, I think there's a couple things, and by the way, I appreciate the double click, right? Because we're learning together here as we hash these
That's the
ideas
fun
out.
part, right?
Yeah, I mean, it really is. Honestly, if you're looking for a reason why people still matter, this is the Socratic discourse we need. Um, Lived experience and breadth and cross pollination, like I mentioned, is certainly a feature of you know a card carrying consultant or professional services person.
Mm.
Great. I think the other side here, and I want to be thoughtful and not even remotely cynical. So please know this is all said constructively and not in a career limiting way. There's this classic line, right, that no man is a prophet in his own town, and
Hmm.
I think it's a Bible verse.
Huh.
But if you fast forward, you, I've heard versions of it said where when you're an outside expert, you're part of the solution, and when you're an inside employee, you're part of the problem.
Mm.
And I think the idea politically, or maybe to get a little less again cynical, anthropologically or socioculturally, is if you're of the machine, you're going to be burdened with all of the stuff that all the great business writers have talked about. Porter's five forces, right?
Mm.
Strategy eats culture, or culture eats strategy for breakfast, or Clayton Christensen, innovator's dilemma, the whole 9 yards. Because organizations exist to protect the cash cow and protect orthodoxy, right? And so I think Toby, just by virtue of being Toby LLC, as opposed to
Mhm.
Toby W-2, the U.S. tax code for employee, um, he carries a different mojo because he's being asked to show up, be objective, and get out of
Yeah.
there, as opposed to like hang out, justify your existence, and sustain the enterprise. So I do think there's something about where one sits, regardless of one's roles or even skills.
That's it's very much aligned with my thinking. And I mean, I know that neither of us are necessarily completely unbiased in all of this, but I agree with you, right? Like it really feels like there's something structurally valuable here, right? It's not literally just, okay, well, there's this cool tool and technology makes this whole thing obsolete. There's something structurally valuable about how organizations and people are positioned to, you know, affect change, to, tell truths, prophesize, if you will.
I mean, even auditors, Deloitte as a Big Four firm with
Good.
its heritage in tax and audit, as well as consulting advisory. I remember learning about the audit function later in life because I didn't grow up in that world. I grew up as a inventor and a geek. And I remember my first hearing of the tale was like, wait a minute, you just double check math? Really? That's what? Like, but what about these other guys? They did the math. You just double checking? And then I realized, oh, wait a minute, this isn't about mathematical wizardry or deep, field metal grade mathematical genius.
Yeah.
This is about, to your point, I like the way you said it, Jeff, the structural need to have independent entities say, this is true, this happened, this we believe. Now, that opens up a whole other world of, frankly, cryptography, blockchains, Bitcoin, and a post-state, post-counterparty future. I don't know if your listenership has the time or brain space to go into, crazy town with In Math We Trust or any of that.
Well, let's dive into it. I mean, we've spent a lot of time talking about what AI can do today. Cryptography, anything in kind of this cyberspace. What's on your radar, and what, in the spirit of the future being here and not necessarily evenly distributed, what are some of the trends you're starting to see, the best organizations start to adapt in this space that maybe we want to, keep our
Yeah.
eye on?
Well, I think it's appropriate and representative of the moment, Jeff, that, 40 something minutes in, it's been AI with a side of AI, right? And again, I mean, let the record reflect, that's what 2025 felt like. For all of those of you listening in the archives 11 years from now, yep, that's how it felt. But I do think there's a handful of other meaningful movements afoot. The first just sort of foreshadowed it a titch, but it felt like decentralized platforms, okay, distributed technology, things like but not limited to blockchain, Bitcoin, Ethereum, all that. It felt like that was a flash in the pan that was a uniquely frothy memory from, say, right before or during COVID, right? And I know that in polite business circles, there's a very common trope where it's like, futurist, huh? Well, tell me about something you got wrong, other than blockchain, which we all got wrong. Ha ha ha. Right? It's like the scapegoat for hype
Right.
gone wrong, right? But I'll tell you what, back to this futurist as historians frame, if you really pull the lens back, let's just say Bitcoin, for argument's sake. If you pull the lens back on Bitcoin, you realize that, yeah, there's been highs and lows, but over a log scale, with both the price of Bitcoin and the time it's taken to get to that price, that train has been up and to the right the whole flipping time.
Mm.
And I don't share this as a curious, get rich quick or slow scheme, right? There's no investment advice anywhere in here. Rather, what I think this represents is this recognition that a lot of smart technologists are starting to say, I don't know if I can trust institutions as much as I used to. And in case that sounded soft, it's me trying to not be binary and say, like, run, the state is dead or anything.
Mhm.
Rather, Thomas Hobbes, the political scientist, he wrote this work called The Leviathan. I remember studying it back when I studied political science. And it was this argument that the modern nation state exists in a world that has no longer believes in, a traditional monotheistic God smiting you with lightning. And so what you need is a state, the Leviathan, that can come and be that, that big stick that the US President Teddy Roosevelt would talk about. Well, that was sort of a move from in God we trust to in state we trust. I think what we're seeing more broadly with Bitcoin, with blockchain, and with decentralized cryptographic technology is we're starting to see a third chapter. It's I don't know if we can trust in state anymore either. Maybe it needs to be in math we trust,
Mm.
right? Maybe it needs to be cryptography or it didn't happen. And so if you think of Bitcoin as the digital transformation of capital and the recognition that this is perfectly scarce and physically sort of digitized perfect gold, you start to say, okay, maybe this isn't as harebrained or wide-eyed as it feels when you hear certain evangelists talk about it. Maybe what we're actually saying is, in a world gone mad where I can't tell deepfakes from real or AI from people or this country I used to trust from this weird acting country, I don't know, what they're doing. You say, oh, I can believe in the SHA-256 algorithm.
Mm.
And so I do think companies that are starting to think of cryptography as a post-trust base layer, they're really at the bleeding edge. I'll take a breath and let you probe there because I know this is a totally different brain space than we were in 5 minutes ago.
No, it's it's super interesting. I mean, I love the framing of it, and yeah, I don't have any, immediate, I've got all sorts of thoughts on, you know, crypto in general, but that's not necessarily where I was going to go with that. Where I was going to go with that is, I love the framing of it and the framing of how do we start to have these digitized trust systems that take us beyond what human institutions are capable of. I mean, do you have any war stories you can share
Yeah.
about any specific organizations that you've seen this at in some capacity or another?
Yeah. Well, I mean, um, with slight redactions, I can give you some
Yeah.
really good crunchy ones. I
Please.
mean, let's not say the B word, Bitcoin, at all. Let's not talk about, finance. Let's talk about,
Mhm.
deep fakes and sort of truth and trust in the deep fake era. I was talking to a newspaper in, Scandinavia who told us that one of the things driving them batty was that they would publish pictures, right, war photos from a place like Ukraine, right? Places including but not limited to the Ukraine. And some plurality of their readership would throw up their hands and say, "This is agenda driven, it's fake news." Uh, and, you know, regardless of what the quality of the picture, it was
Yeah.
clearly that you had sort of a radicalized readership that felt like, this was about, left versus right or up versus down or something. What they did was they began issuing their photographers cameras with special chips embedded that in addition to recording the time of the shot, the latitude and the longitude, it added a simple cryptographic hash. And that cryptographic hash basically said, this picture actually came from this time and place, and I can prove it through the hash.
Huh.
Well, what was so interesting was that creates what in legal circles is called a chain of custody, digital provenance, so that if that picture is printed along with that digital hash, that watermark, regardless of what you'd prefer to believe, who you personally believe are the good guys and the bad guys, that picture was taken on that camera in that place at that time, and the math says so.
Mm.
And so to me, I thought, wow, this feels really early, right? Really early in the movie. But in the same way that me as a Gen Xer, I used to use that old phrase, "Pix or it didn't happen," right?
Mhm.
We might be seeing the emergence of a new generation that says, "Dude, chain or it didn't happen," right? I because if you can't believe your own eyes and ears anymore, what do you believe? You believe the hash, the code. There was another story I'll give you. A finance employee at a large organization wired something like 25 or $2.5 million, a non-trivial amount, substantial, out of the corporate treasury. And it turned out it was because they accidentally gave their boss a password to like a PowerPoint presentation that he asked for over Zoom. But it turned out the boss wasn't the boss. It was, if you remember the old Nigerian prince,
Mhm.
the boss was the artist formerly known as the Nigerian prince. But instead of a poorly worded AOL email, this cat was coming in hot with believable 4K video and audio.
Yeah.
And so I think similarly, really interesting organizations like Reality Defender and others that used mixed model approaches, some involving the blockchain, some using AI, that are really trying to say, listen, in a world where you can't trust your eyes and ears anymore, you're going to have to trust the math. And so, back to elevation, lot of jobs for math savvy Tobies in that space.
Well, and yeah, I'm processing that, but it feels just to kind of dovetail this with our earlier conversation, it feels like the moment for it in some ways, right? Because if you look at what some of these tools and capabilities can do in terms of the fakes, you know, up and to the right, maybe, exponentially asymptotically. And so the demand for prove it to me is
Right.
also off the charts, right? So yeah, no, I can appreciate why, today, tomorrow, and every day after, it's more and more valuable to be able to demonstrate what's real.
It's there's a entrepreneur and thoughtful entrepreneur and writer in the space by the name of Balaji Srinivasan, whose newsletter is, in my experience, a pretty good read. And he recently talked about this idea that all property will become cryptography. The idea being that, if you take this family of concepts we've been discussing and run them fast forward for the next 15 years, the only verifiable proof that you're you and your stuff is your stuff will be delivered in that sort of on-chain, like
Mm.
in math we trust framing. And I thought, goodness gracious, to think that we thought this stuff was written off with NFTs and SBF. I think it's only
Yeah.
just begun.
It's it's a really interesting thought experiment, and it's not hard for me to believe that there's like some sort of like tipping point where once enough is proven with cryptography, like the old fashioned way, or oh yeah, there's something at City Hall, or a bank said so. Like it almost feels quaint, right? Like how could you possibly like trust that?
So I like your frame of tipping point, Jeff. That's right. That's right. I think Malcolm Gladwell is probably smiling somewhere because you're you're completely right. I mean, having worked with some of the biggest organizations in the world, I know how early distributed solutions felt quaint to them, right? Like if you're, I will not name names here, but if you're a super well-known global household retailer and you're experimenting with, blockchain-based supply chain systems, 10 years ago, you throw your hands up and you go, let's just use ours. And that made a bunch of sense. But if again, this is the trick with the future, right? We as humans, we struggle with the exponential function. And so as that little acorn network grows to sapling, grows to oak, grows to sequoia, then all of a sudden the idea that one company could be the master data management system for the
Mhm.
entire human race, that's the quaint one. And so you're right. It ain't tipped yet, but when it tips, it tips big. In the Bitcoin community, they call that moment hyper Bitcoinization. And again, it can feel a little fever dreamed in that space, but the argument is there's going to be a moment where fiat currencies suddenly stop feeling like gospel and start feeling like monopoly money.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a heck of a 2-week ride for the valuation of fiat versus, digital.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's a really interesting thought. Probably not one we'll have to earmark that for our next conversation.
Oh,
You,
I
you
agree.
touched on something that I did want to come back to though, Mike,
Sure.
which is you have a really interesting gig in the sense that you're in the boardrooms of these, household name organizations. You talk to the leaders, hear about their hopes and dreams and darkest fears, and, tell them your vision, of the future or something like that anyway. And I'm curious, like, when you talk to these people, is there a particular piece of advice that you find yourself giving them lately? Like, is there something you find that they're overlooking or underestimating that probably needs a little bit more emphasis?
Hmm. It's a really nice question, Jeff. That question speaks well of your humane and artisanal creation of today's questions. Yeah, the robot didn't give you that. You know, the two things I find myself sharing most frequently with boards of directors, so people at the tippity top. Thing one, and it has to be said first because I think it's the big one. It's that regardless of the sort of complexity and velocity and turbulence that we feel is increasing in all of our sectors and all of our lives, it'll never be calmer than it is right now, right? And the fundamental precepts of business are the same, right? We're in business to serve others, right? And so what I'm often always reminding the top people at our top clients is start with your customers, lead with need, right? What are their itches in need of scratching? Where are they stuck? And if you work backwards from there, you'll find that the future's never been brighter. You've never had better tools, and you've never had a shorter sort of connection between imagination and impact, right? You can use zeitgeisty words like vibe coding, but what it's really all about is dream it, do it, right? That used to be a 2-year thing. Now it's a 2-minute thing. Go get it, right? But what are you going to do? Lead with need. That's thing one. And then I think thing two, at the tippity top of the biggest clients is think of technology as a tool set that allows you to grow and play offense, not just as a risk source that has to be constantly thought of as threats and defense. Because something I've seen, Jeff, is most boards, understandably, right, they're populated by former CEOs or CFOs. Most CEOs are former CFOs. So what you tend to get is this financial mindset that doesn't look at tech as a thing they grew up with and have affinity for and as a growth vector. They look at it as the cyber thing that presents risks. And I think again, the primary is lead with need and customer, but I think the secondary is usually, hey, you spend so much time worrying about what might go wrong. What if you spend a little bit of time imagining what could go right? And it's tricky, right? Because these people have seen a lot and they're smart and they're accomplished, but a little dose of healthy, constructive optimism, right? Delivered as pragmatism, it goes a long way.
It's yeah. I love both of those answers, and it got me thinking. What it got me thinking about is, and I'm sure you talk about this all the time, but specifically in that context, I was thumbing through Deloitte's trend reports for the technology trend reports for this year, and what caught my attention first is I'm not gonna belabor this, but there's 6 trends, and if I'm reading it correctly, basically 3 of the trends are all about corporate IT. If you look at, and there's things like, I'm going to screw up the wording of your trend, so I apologize
It's
for
all
that.
good.
But there's something like, how IT can be amplified, modernization, and then something about cybersecurity. But the notion that we're talking about, like, 50% of it is this thing that probably for most boards, CFOs, CEOs, you think is this boring, line item that, represents somewhere between, a necessary evil and a catastrophic risk can unlock things. I don't know, that caught my attention. Is that something that you've been talking about? Like, is that related to the point you were just making?
Yeah, kind of, it is. And the reason I verbally caveat with the kind of is, Jeff, it's interesting. Deloitte Tech Trends, it's we're headed into our 17th year. And when it was originally conceived by my friend and partner Bill Briggs and Mark White, oh man, making me feel old. But the idea was, hey, um, we as Deloitte are more technical and get our hands dirtier than you, dear clients, might
Hmm.
suspect. Behold our command of the zeitgeist. and and so the implied audience, the explicit audience, was IT leaders, CIOs, right? Well, what happened in those intervening 17 years, Jeff, was that I call it rising sea levels, right? Suddenly you had this doppelganger character, the CTO. What's she all about? Well, she's focused on product technology and growth vectors. Unlike the CIO, he's focused on, keeping the blinky lights blinking, right? Then there was the CISO. What are they in charge of? Keeping us out of jail, right? Then there's the CDAO. What are they in charge of? Databases, analytics, Hadoop. Well, the punchline is this: the audience broadened. And in parallel with that, the when you talked about the sort of IT as kind of necessary evil or cost center, you started to hear a little bit more about IT as strategic enabler for growth, like from the CEOs and all that. And so during my tenure leading our Deloitte Tech Trends, we started broadening the explicit readership goal and saying, listen, we want something that speaks to the C-suite and Gen Pop, to
Hmm.
borrow a language from pharma, right? The general population, uh, but still has enough, as we call it, crunch for that traditional IT, leadership and managerial layer. And so I'm grateful that you kind of see it, which is to say, um, if it's all high level strategery, the engineers are going to wonder, if it's snake oil. If it's all IT white paper, you'll never get the meeting with the board. And so Deloitte Tech Trends really tries to walk that balance between the boardroom and the server room, knowing that if anybody can get those two groups into cahoots, it's Deloitte.
That I appreciate you sharing that lens. It makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm curious from your perspective because I know you have somewhat of a background in this, Mike. IT seems to be a place where AI is kind of front and center. Yeah, obviously, all new tech is sort of front and center there, sometimes for the right reasons, sometimes for the wrong reasons. But when I say AI is front and center, I both mean because they often hold the keys to AI, or at least they hope they do. Sometimes they don't, and that's that's a whole separate conversation.
Yeah.
But also because AI for a long time, again in the eyes of senior leadership, has kind of been. And I'm curious in your perspective, but at least from where I sit, there's this battle of, well, why don't we just outsource the whole damn thing? Like it's
Mm.
not a value center. And so what I'm starting to see is conversations around, well, how much of IT can we just AIify, right? Do we need all these pesky, expensive people anyway when we don't really understand what's going on? Um, and there's this tension, and by the way, there's this other trend that's out there, and I think it ties to your rising sea level, which is, as you said, it used to be there was the CIO and they held everything, and then all these shadow roles started popping up. And the moral of the story is, and CIOs frown when I say this to them, but the other roles got all the cool stuff, and the CIO was left with like the blinky lights, to use your words, right?
Yeah.
And so I guess my question is, in your eyes, what's the future of IT? How do
I'll
organizations need to be thinking about this and structuring it, assuming that their goal is exactly what you said? It's um, how do we get more intimate in terms of client needs? How do we build the products of the future, build the future we want? What role does IT play in that?
well, at at the risk of sounding a little bit, I don't know, commercial slash performative, I would say, I have a heartily recommend my colleague Lou DiLorenzo, who leads our technology, AI, and data strategy function, who's really all in on this idea of the future of the IT function for our clients around the world. But I'll do my best sort of poor man's retelling of of Lou's great work and vision here. You know, I think the future of the IT function, it's really about showing up arm in arm with what IT teams call the business, right? And I'm sure you've had plenty of guests on, they talk about the business as though it's this other thing. Well,
Mhm.
in a lot of companies, it can feel that way, right? Where like IT as a service provider to the business people. Where that's headed, right? The future of that is the elevation of IT into strategic partner. And the way that's made manifest is you, you show up less as an order taker and more as a change maker. And okay, that can, it rhymes, it's got that going for it, but what's it really mean? What it means is a rich command of the art of the possible as opposed to sort of stewardship of legacy systems, right? That's one reason why some folks felt relegated to the blinky lights, right? Your arcane knowledge of the old Bessie and back ain't gonna do it, right?
Mm.
You gotta be aware of the latest and greatest. Second, financial fluency, right? Third, business model acumen. Taken together, what we're seeing is that the future of the IT function tends to be sort of IT amplified. That's why one of our trends this year in Deloitte Tech Trends is really all about this idea that we did a study as part of our trends. We said, are those IT groups who are using AI shrinking or growing in headcount? And curiously, I thought it was interesting. Companies who are leaning into IT found themselves with growing IT headcounts. Why? Because they were surprising and delighting the business stakeholders, right? Shades of that first, the old Michael Keaton
Mhm.
Batman. Where does he get these wonderful toys? They would say, wait a minute, you can do X? To which the IT folks could say, yeah, and with ever so incrementally more resources, headcount, and capability, we could do Y. Like, done. And so I think IT as being more generative, more entrepreneurial, more strategic, that's where it's going. And they're going to do that in large part with the help of AI. What you're going to see less of is that kind of reactive stewardship of legacy systems, right? Because that stuff, just like when we opened our conversation, Jeff, that's going to be automated and quick.
Yeah, it's exciting. It's really exciting. And let me maybe play that back to you, Mike, and see if I captured the spirit of it, which is
Yeah.
the organizations that are really good at this, whether it's good with AI or, good at kind of developing the business models of tomorrow, will probably actually have bigger IT or corporate technology teams than they do today, but they won't necessarily look like the teams they have today. It'll be a different set of skills than they've had so far. It's not necessarily like, oh, we've doubled our number of coders or database administrators. It's we've built more connective tissue around, to use your words, finance and business model and art of the possible. And with that, we've created this newly shaped, newly resourced organization. Am I somewhere near the mark there?
Yeah. Yeah. And with a much greater economy of words than me, because I filibustered
Well,
at you pretty fiercely
I
there.
I had the benefit of listening to you say it first, so shoulders of giants and all that.
No, not at all. I mean, Jeff, I think you captured it well. I mean, i- if we want to bring things full circle, niche knowns and that's more easily maybe read than said, but known craft in deep arcane niches. Okay. That's
Yeah.
the stuff that AI automates in a big way, right? And so application maintenance roles, right? Operational staging roles, right? The artist currently known as DevSec FinOps, once merely known as DevOps or something. A lot of that stuff becomes increasingly automated, right? And again, back to our open, that doesn't mean that all these people are, in for a really bad Tuesday, right? What it means is like, good news, Janet, um, we have the opportunity to focus now on the new capability building that our customers are asking for, right? And so think of it as a mixing board, less time on app maint and DevOps, more time on customer needs analysis, prototyping, and app dev. And I think for years, my clients have said, yeah, we'd love to get to that, but 80% of our budget goes to keeping this old rust bucket ticking. Well, good news. It need no longer be redeployed that way in an age of AI.
Yeah. No, it's really exciting, the possibilities it can unlock. And yeah, the leaders in the organizations that I work with, even the ones who will, swear a blue streak up and down about IT, it's not, when you really get into it, it's not like, oh, I hate the people. It's typically not even, I hate what they deliver. It's, could they go a little bit faster, please? Like, I've got this laundry list of things I need, and for whatever reason, delivery is the issue. And so, the idea that you can deliver more and have tools that help you deliver more, it's an exciting prospect if you can get it right.
I think so. I mean, I had this discussion, Jeff. This is adjacent to your point you just made, but it feels right to share it right here. I was talking to a fella in a board meeting. He was the only former chief technology officer in a room full of former executive officers and financial officers, right? So he was, in his own parlance, the only geek at the table. And somebody was talking about something cyber something. And he says, "Well, yeah, but that's Bob's thing, and we don't understand Bob's thing." And they just moved on. And he looked over to me after that microaggression, if you will, and he said, "See how they joke about that? If I joked about not knowing finance or legal, it would be a career limiting move." And
Huh.
the reason I bring that story up here in our visit, Jeff, is I think that's beginning to change. I think there's an emergent, right? We're not late in the movie, early innings, but there's an emergent
Mhm.
recognition at the tippy top that this isn't that that IT is no longer perceived culturally as plumbing and as a
Mhm.
cost center, but as rocket fuel to do work with radically less in the way of COGS and SG&A and radically more in the way of growth potential and margin potential. And so I'm bullish. I'm bullish on
Yeah.
smart IT groups that can position themselves as rocket fuel and not ballast.
I I love that framing, and I love that story. And it's, you preempted my question anyway, which is, I'm glad to hear that you think there's going to be more CTOs on the board, and I think so too. And frankly, I think it's a, yeah, it's a really good thing. And if part of what this, new wave of technology can do is, siphon off the plumbing in some way, so not everybody needs to understand it, I think that makes it more accessible, and we all win out for it. Um,
Yeah,
one more detour I wanted to take us on, which is,
sure.
as I was thinking about this and these skills, you're a professor of innovation. And I was thinking about that as you were answering a lot of these questions. I've got a bit of a background in innovation, and I could, was kind of checking. Oh yeah, that does sound like something an innovation guy would say, which is great, which
Wait a
is
minute.
great.
Tunnel. What? Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Um, what's what's kind of your posture? What do you tell students who are this next generation coming into the workforce these days? You know, there's been this thread in this conversation of the importance of innovation, maybe a decreasing importance in some of the technical skills. What are you bullish about? Where should they not be, thinking of taking particular paths? What's your guidance for the next generation to be successful in this new world?
What I tell my students at the University of Notre Dame, there's been a 25-year tyranny, in my opinion, of hyperspecialization. A and I'll give you some data to back this up. I've sat on the advisory board at the University of Notre Dame's business school for nearly 20 years. And I remember when I graduated from ND and from Notre Dame in 1998, I was an anthropology and political science major with a minor in philosophy and economics. But the time I spent coding Doom configs in the campus computer cluster and the HTML I learned in the background, it made me the right kind of guy. It made me employable enough. So I became a techie. By 2020, companies like mine at that time were saying, well, could you be a business major? Right? By 2020 or 2005, sorry, did I say 2020? 2000 was like that. By 2005, it felt like, how about finance specifically? Can you be a finance major? By 2010, it was, can you kindly double major in finance and computer engineering? Right. And 5 years ago, honest to God, Jeff, it felt like, if you don't have a Nobel laureate, you need not apply. And so when I talk about the tyranny of specialization, think of this generation long musical chairs game where there's one less seat every 5 years. And God help you if you don't end up in the tech one or the banker one.
Hmm.
Well, I believe the AI moment is changing that. Because for the reasons we've discussed, Jeff, suddenly your arcane knowledge of Python don't matter, right? Your deep understanding of glitch trading strategies, you ain't going to be faster than a robot. And so what does matter? I think it's breadth. It's cross-pollination between disparate, right? Even radically unrelated disciplines that's going to help people differentiate. And so what I tell the students is I say, listen, don't just be yourself, right? Oscar Wilde has this great quote, be yourself, everyone else is already taken. Love it. I think it's be all yourselves, right? If you can be the polymath, the Renaissance person who shows up at an interview and says, yeah, my unique knowledge of how to bake scones combined with my ability to ride a unicycle and everything I learned from there, combined with my understanding of ethnographies from my time in Cambodia, on the surface, it feels like just the kind of jack of all trades, master of none that nobody's been hiring for 20 years. But I'll tell you what, to me, Jeff, that sounds like exactly the kind of cross-disciplinary prompt engineering, right? Generative, courageous polymath that I'm going to want, right? Because the genie lamps, they're waiting for interesting wishes. And you're not going to get those from somebody whose entire book of lived experience is just finance, just comp sci, or just anything.
It's such an optimistic message, which is, so refreshing from so much of the doom and gloom you hear about, oh, there's not going to be any jobs, or, what are you possibly going to do with all this stuff? And I'm such a big advocate for that. And I love the notion that you can just go and learn what you want and collect these experiences, and that those can be a source of strength. It seemed to me for a long time, and your story completely resonates, that there's this narrative of you're supposed to take a path. And if you find yourself on detours, if you find yourself, oh, I thought this was my path, but now I have to go this way. Well, now you're behind.
Right.
And what I heard you say, Mike, is you're not behind. You've collected experiences, you've collected abilities now to cross pollinate that are unique to you, and you know, help extend your own value in a way that nobody else is going to have.
And Jeff, you said it so beautifully, and you've taught me something, brother, because your distillation sort of elegantly captures what I've resorted to video game language to use, namely, my boys, well, and my daughter too, all three of them have taught me about this idea of an NPC, right? So you're
Mm.
playing a video game and like, who's that? That's my friend Bobby. Who's that? That's an NPC, non-player character. They're not real. They're an AI, right? Well, in this world where we're going to be dealing with more and more NPCs, right? Right. We got this far into the discussion without having to talk about agents, but yeah, that too, right? But in a world where AIs excel at all of the known rote everything, the only real value prop around is, yeah, your unique differentiated bag of experiences. What makes you you? And it feels a little maybe hippie, but again, if you're going to stay a step or two ahead of the AI, it's going to have to be by bringing things to the world that the AI hasn't seen yet. And so I think it's stock up, novelty, imagination, cross pollination, and yeah, stock down, repetition, emulation, right, and grinding.
The other piece that's cool about that is that this is not like not like lifelong learning is not a skill that you lose as soon as you graduate, right? It makes the case for why you should be continuously cross pollinating and continuously learning, which I love, and I
Yeah.
think that's an awesome message to end on.
Well, Jeff, what a treat it is as Hangouts go. This was an absolute privilege, but as first Hangouts go, it was sublime. I mean, thanks for reaching out and for having me, sir.
Hey, thanks so much for sharing your insights today, Mike. A lot of ground we covered today. Really appreciate your insights. Lots of cool stuff, whether it's the tech stuff, whether it's the mindset around that. I feel like from students to the C-suite, we kind of covered it all. So that was really awesome. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.